Hello and good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here with us this evening. We have some music on the go and hopefully some wonderful questions to get started with fairly shortly. I would like to say thank you to those of you who are joining. It's wonderful to be able to have this opportunity to have a chat with you. So I framed the topic as From Clarity to Chaos. The idea here is, ooh, I have music, something in the background. Let's see. I think I've managed to kill it. There we go. Cool. So the idea is basically the topic is from clarity, or from chaos to clarity, at least. I would help if I get it the right way around. And the idea is to explore some of the questions that have been coming up on LinkedIn and social media over the last couple of days and weeks. But first, I would like to see, where is everybody connecting from? I'm really curious to see where folks are joining from. Just type in the chat. It would be super cool to hear where you're from. Gainesville, Florida. Hello, Becky. Sophia joining from London. That's fantastic. And Bob from Johannesburg, Mzansi. Awesome. Cool. So I had a couple of things that I thought I would just share to kind of get us started and recap a little bit. But the main point of today's session is that I'd like to cover questions and so on that are coming up from all of you. So I want to give you the opportunity to fire away any questions that you have in the chat. And so as we go, let's just jump in and see what comes up. I am going to turn the music down. Cool. So there's been a couple of things that I've been sharing on the internet over the last couple of weeks, talking a lot about flight levels. And very specifically, I've had a run of questions talking about focus primarily as a topic. So I guess some of the main questions that we could look into is getting started with flight levels, as we said. We could talk a little bit about creating focus. And of course, I'm totally open to talking about some of my time spent at Spotify and some of the things that I've done since then. I see some other folks joining. Petra from Sweden. Yes, welcome. You are just around the corner from me. And then we have Imberti from Brazil. Nice to have you, my friend. Hello, beautiful man. And of course, my dad, Mark Hazel from Grahamstown. Nice to have you on the stream. Very cool. And Camilla from Ontario in Canada. That's very, very cool. So we're quite a varied bunch from all over the place. Let's jump in. Sophia has a first question for us to kick things off. The question we have here: how to explain flight levels to executives? So this is a question that I get quite a lot, and I get it in a couple of different forms. So one of them is just straight up, as you've asked it, how do we explain it to the execs? The other is, how do I kind of convince people? Because obviously there are some folks that maybe we need to support this initiative or this idea that we have. So the first piece of advice that I have in this situation is, I think it's really helpful to think about having some empathy for the folks who are affected by the change that you're suggesting. And what I mean by that is basically the more you lean into understanding what their specific context is and the things that they care about, the more likely you are to be able to connect with the problems and the challenges and the opportunities that they see. So I'll give you an example. If we talk only about dependencies and blockers and problems that we face within the context of a level 1 team, maybe the CEO of the company doesn't care so much about these kind of problems. That's kind of somebody else's issue. So what I like to talk about is things like, how does this affect product delivery or project delivery? How does it affect maybe our ability to delegate and the amount of time and energy we have to spend on working on these things, specifically as a senior leader? And usually, not to make it exclusively about money, but usually the executives in the company do also care about the economic performance of the business. And so I try to talk about things in terms of monetary impact. So a couple of days ago, I had a story that I posted about a client that I worked with where we built a flight level 2 system. And the outcome of that was that we took the lead time for projects from around about 36 months on average, all the way down to 6 to 12 weeks. Now, from the perspective of an exec, I think that's something that probably resonates fairly significantly, especially when you talk to them about how we also have the opportunity to pick which of those things comes out first. So one of the pieces that I like to lean into on this is I have a little story that I tell about how if we do 4 projects over the course of 1 year, most companies, what we do is we start working on all 4 at the beginning of the year. We work on them the whole way through the year, and somehow magically they end at December, just before everybody goes on Christmas break and gets their bonuses. Uh, the challenge with this, of course, is that everything is kind of expanded to fit the time available. And so what I like to do instead is say, well, imagine if instead of doing all 4 at the same time, maybe we pick 2 and we work on those 2 from January until June. And then shortly after that, once we've finished them, we start the next 2 in the middle of the year, and we finish them at the end of the year. The idea here is perhaps a little bit of an oversimplification, but the idea here basically is that what we can get from this shift is that we start to see the results from the first 2 projects that we delivered already from halfway through the year. So we have 2 whole quarters of potential impact from the things that we've delivered. This, I think, is something, or certainly from my experience, has been something that resonates with the executives. I was talking to a CEO a couple of weeks ago and was talking about this exact idea. And I certainly think that in many cases, this is something that's resonating. So, Zofia, I'm curious to hear if you think this is helping with your specific situation. And maybe you could give a little bit more context on what else is behind your question, if there's something else that maybe is you're wondering about. But hopefully that gives a little bit of a sense of what's going on. Cool. I want to just quickly say hi to Matthias. I see you're joining from Cologne. So thanks for joining us. Not too far away. Yeah. Cool. And I see you have a question as well. So let's have a look here. Matthias says, what are the best flight level simulations you know how to explain and train them in below 2 hours? So Becky is pointing out that maybe 2 hours is a bit of a tall order. The thing that I like to use, and I use this actually in a number of my workshops, is something that I call the flow experiment or the shipbuilding exercise. If I do it in a live sort of live training environment or a live space, then I do it with basically we build some paper boats and we're simulating how flow works. If you don't have the opportunity to meet in person, I have a Miro template that I use, which is a little thing where we build and assemble some pieces of work. You've probably seen something a little bit similar to this before, or maybe you've even done it in a workshop in the past. But the idea basically here is that what we want to try to see is the benefit of focus. And specifically what I'm trying to do is get people to see the benefit of using that focus on a level 2 situation. That's often the route that I see people having as like a way into the organization, starting with flight level 2. I don't know if this helps. I think the key really is that a big difference, maybe what you're hinting at with sort of the simulation, is that folks kind of want to see how does the whole thing work. Maybe that's what's resonating or what's behind your question there, Matthias. I think part of the challenge is that very often in a change situation, what we do is we tend to change a lot of things. And so one of the things that I try to recommend to people to do when you're using flight levels is actually to tone it down quite a lot. Pick the one thing, or find, as I like to call it, the leverage, the key point that has some sort of really powerful, huge, significant impact, or is likely to reduce a pain in some substantial manner. And the idea here basically is that we fix just that thing and then take the next step. The reason for this is quite simply that if we change a lot of things, the change work also consumes the same capacity as the delivery work. And usually the organizations that we're working with, where we might think that it's a good idea to introduce flight levels, we are often sitting in a situation where we are already overloaded. And so the idea of adding more work into an already busy system seems like perhaps a little bit counterintuitive. And so often what I'll try to do is start maybe with something that is a little bit removing some ideas or taking some things away, or just picking one key thing that we want to try to change and address. So if you imagine flight levels working in your organization, outside of there being a flight level 2 and maybe a flight level 3 system, some different points of interaction and contact, actually operating flight levels in the real world for a team at level 1 doesn't look so different. And for folks at level 2, often there's just one place where they see things changing. So let's see. I see you know the pizza Kanban method or the simulation as well. I can see how this maybe is adaptable perhaps to a flight levels context as well. But thanks for the question. Yeah, I'm curious. I see you're giving a thumbs up and you're saying thanks. So that tells me that I've at least answered part of your question, which is the goal. So cool. So let's see. We have another question there from Zafia. Sophia is saying, how do flight levels differ from existing concepts? I mentioned the or WIP, which is known from Kanban. So there's a number of ways, and I usually don't like to get too much into sort of a debate about it because the point for me is not so much what's different or what's similar, this kind of a thing. But really, the idea here is that what we want to try to do is connect the different parts of the organization together. Klaus likes to say often is that there's this idea basically of trying to connect the islands within the organization, right? What we find is that there's some people over here who are doing some sort of Scrum, some people over there doing Kanban, some people doing SAFe, some people doing things in HR and in finance who often are not using agile methods and approaches. And of course, we have many situations where maybe an agile method or approach is not necessarily necessary. So what we try to do is maybe look at the interactions between those systems and say, well, firstly, we have a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3. Where are we looking to make the improvement? So it's firstly a thinking model in the meta sense to be able to try to pick where would we make an improvement. Secondly, what we can do is then try to create some clearer interactions across the hierarchy, as well as between teams within a single level of flight level systems. So what does that mean? Well, me as a team on the ground, I can start to see a little bit of a picture of how does the thing that I do today actually relate to the project and initiative that we're doing, and all the way up to the strategy at level 3, paints a bit of a picture for the whole thing. So I don't know if that sort of touches on what's behind your question there around the existing concepts. I think it's quite different, primarily in that it's not primarily about trying to be necessarily agile in the capital A agile methods kind of approach. And that also that we're trying to look for the smallest possible amount of change in order to be effective, which is something that is quite in contrast to a lot of how other people approach things, where they change all the things and then hope that somehow boiling the ocean is going to fix the challenges that they have. Cool. Hopefully that gives some sense of the answer. I think that there's quite a few differences there. So yeah, thanks for the question, Sophia. Cool. Let's see. I think Becky is making perhaps an observation more than asking a question, but I want to talk a little bit to this. You say it sounds like many of the known concepts are incorporated into flight levels, and what works for the org in the toolbox. The thing that I want to highlight with this is that very often what I find is that I want to find the things inside the org that are already working. I think very often in a change initiative type approach, especially as a consultant coming in, we look at things as if like, well, everything is broken, we have to fix it all. And the risk with this, I don't know if everybody here knows the metaphor, but in South Africa, we say throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is kind of a strange metaphor now that I think about it. But the point is basically, we don't want to throw away all the good things along with the thing that we were trying to get rid of. And I think very often without taking the time to understand what's going on, we run the risk of doing that. So really what I want to try to do as a first point is understand what is actually working inside the company before we go and say what's not working. It's very easy to point and say, oh, well, this thing's broken and that thing's broken and this thing's an issue. But if we don't actually know what works, and I would say if you can't find at least one thing inside your company that works, you probably didn't take enough time to understand what's going on. In my experience, most companies have been quite successful already. And so there probably are some things that maybe work, maybe not flawlessly. So there could be some room for improvement still, but I like to at least acknowledge what's there. So what that means in connection to what you're saying here, Becky, is that we not only incorporate existing tools and methods that are kind of known in the universe, but also things that are actually practically used within the context of the company as well. So yeah, cool. So let's see. We have Petra. Petra has a question. How does flight levels correlate with the scaled agile framework like SAFe? So I'll be honest, I have not worked directly with SAFe. I've worked in a lot of organizations who have previously or recently used SAFe. And often the ask that I get when I come in is to help them get some of the benefits maybe that they haven't yet realized from using some other methods and tools, as you particularly point to, is SAFe. I think one of the things that a lot of the time happens is that specifically with big methods like SAFe, what can happen is not necessarily that the framework itself is a broken idea, but because there's so much inside it, there's kind of something a little bit for everyone, which arguably I would say from a sales and marketing perspective is a fantastic idea. But when it comes to practically making change happen inside an organization, the problem with this is that there's something for everyone. And so the project and transformation becomes this ginormous, huge thing. And so we're sprinkling a lot of effort to try to change many different things. And quite often, what we find is not so much actual significant improvement, although many things did actually change. We don't necessarily see sort of key indicators or significant changes that customers can feel, which is ultimately the thing that I'm caring about. So what I think is different is that what I would do is say, not throw away what you're doing with SAFe or Scrum or Kanban or anything else, but use flight levels to actually look at the organization and say, firstly, at which level, but at which interaction point as well, do we have an opportunity to make an improvement? You might have your release trains, for example, working super smooth, but they don't yet connect to the strategy, or they exist, but they don't yet work so well with certain departments or other areas of the business. And in that situation, I would say maybe using something like flight levels could be an interesting way to actually add something to a situation where you are already using something like SAFe. So yeah, Petra, I'm curious to hear how that resonates with your experience and your thinking. I think it could be something interesting to consider. Cool, thanks for the question. So let's have a look here. We have Camilla asking, do you have examples of how this framework can/could work for HR/people functions? I think that's a fantastic question. And I like to say that the two most important departments that I think we are sort of under approaching or not really dealing with in the world of Agile is HR and finance. And the reason for this is that HR, to some extent, certainly, if not, is responsible for the culture and creation of the culture, certainly at least through the hiring and deciding who gets into the company in the first place, but also, who gets to stay around, what positions and roles they have. The other one being finance, because ultimately they get to set the budgeting process and have a huge influence in terms of how we do planning, how we assess the results and measure the impact of the things that we deliver. So examples that I can give you of this is actually connecting multiple departments together across a single value stream. So, give you an example. Maybe in a hiring department, or at least in a hiring part of the HR function, we may need to connect into multiple different parts of the business and the organization. And often the challenge with any kind of organization that is sort of a shared service, if you will, like you service or provide services to many different parts of the business, you can end up pulled in many, many different directions. So the question often becomes, well, where does HR actually sit? They are, of course, their own function in the reporting structure, but do they sit and plug in only at the strategy level? Or do they plug in at maybe the department or the value stream level? Or perhaps do they plug in at the team level? And so what I've seen is a couple of different variations where we actually have either representation through somebody like an HRBP or perhaps through a hiring team from the recruitment side, sitting at a flight level 2 system or attending some of the conversations around this to be able to actually say, well, okay, this project, that initiative, this area, this department or whatever is the area where I'm going to focus and pay my attention or pay a little bit closer attention. I've also used it a couple of times within the HR functions, maybe building something like a flight level 2 system across the HR function in and of itself. I've used it particularly in the context of recruitment and maybe trying to optimize the onboarding, hiring flow, and so on. Visualizing where in the pipeline are the candidates getting stuck, what are the opportunities to improve around onboarding and these kind of things. And I've also seen it working quite well in the people development, specifically in the space of like a learning and development department, where they're responsible for maybe training and employee skills development, this kind of a thing. Mapping out some of the workflows and measuring the outcomes so that we're not just running trainings, running workshops, hiring people. We're actually checking, do we get the outcome that we're looking for in terms of people who are staying at the company, being successful in the environment, and contributing in a meaningful manner? Camilla, I'm curious, without knowing a lot about the context with which you asked that question from, maybe you could give a little bit more in the chat and see. I'd be happy to share some more, but those are the things that come to mind from what you've said so far. So thanks for the question. I want to highlight something that Becky's saying here again. Easier to improve on existing things rather than wholesale change. I want to give a double +1 to this, 2 thumbs up from my side. I like this approach of amplifying the bright spots rather than just trying to mitigate the flaws and problems. There's a huge amount of value in taking something that already works and trying to clone, copy, or duplicate it to amplify the effect within the organization. The most significant benefit that I see of this is that we get around this thing of, well, that doesn't work here because we already know what works here because it's already working in your company. And so if you find those situations and instead of saying, well, let's go and change a bunch of things, you say, well, how can we get this department over here where Becky's working to teach the folks in this department over here where I'm working how to do the same things that we already do? Super cool way to create some cross-pollination between the teams rather than just necessarily introducing something new. Cool. Thanks, Becky. Cool. Mr. Bob has a question. Do you have a rule of thumb in terms of size/scale of an organization or the number of flight levels that are useful? i.e., do all orgs benefit from level 2 and 3 or only large organizations? So there's a couple of different ways that I could answer this question. I think in terms of an organization, if you're only one person, having 3 flight levels is probably a little bit absurd. But you might have something like a long-term strategy, a mid-term strategy, and some tactical stuff that you're doing today. If I was visualizing this, what I would probably do is instead of building 3 separate systems, I would do that on one or maybe on 2 different parts of a system. So I would have sort of a much longer term looking view and a much more tactical view. Often when I describe how the flight level systems work, I describe them as overlapping. So if you think about it, that we've got strategic initiatives, maybe quarterly, and some sort of detail on the strategy system, what often happens is that there's an overlapping point between the two, right? Where we actually have the lowest level of detail on the flight level 3 being mirrored on the flight level 2. So lowest level of detail on 3 becomes the highest level of detail on level 2. So this is one way that you can split 2 systems if you're trying to break them up, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have all 3 variations. In terms of a rule of thumb, I would say somewhere in the range of 30 to 300 is nice for a flight level 2 system. And significantly bigger than that is where I would say it starts to become beneficial to consider maybe you need multiple flight level 2 systems. I would say that I've used flight level 2 and 3 often as a combined single layer visualization. So it's one visualization showing both of the levels. Again, just to emphasize, the point of the levels is not levels in the hierarchy. It's not level 3 is where the CEO works, level 2 is where mid-managers work, and level 1 is where the teams work. It does sometimes correlate a little bit like this, but the point actually is that it's levels of abstraction. So we're zooming in and out of the org at levels of detail, and the point is to try to keep them connected together. Sometimes the best way to do this, related to your question, is to put both two of the levels of detail on one single visualization to be able to see what happens. And I've seen a lot of beneficial impact from doing this kind of stuff where you show, here's the strategy and here's the projects we're running as a result of trying to fulfill that strategy. And then separately in each of the teams, we could visualize the specific activities that each of us are doing. But because we have that higher level, we can see what's going on. So, short version is basically yes, I think it's beneficial to have all three levels, but I don't necessarily think that you have to build completely different systems or have vastly even different meetings necessarily and conversations around each of those systems, if that makes sense. I'm curious, Bob, if that's shed some light on your question. My experience, just to your question of like what's the sort of smallest number almost in a way, I would say that somewhere around about 10 or 15 people is probably a nice point. But even if you're 3 or 4, you might benefit from doing this all on a single, level 1 is the detail, level 2 is kind of the bigger chunks and initiatives, and level 3 is sort of this longer term strategic outcomes. Cool. Thanks for the question. Then let's have a look here. Cool. Camilla, sharing a bit of context. I'm a product manager turned chief of staff for the chief people officer, and we've actively been trying to bring product and agile into our function. I think that's exactly, or that sheds at least a bunch of light on where your line of question is coming from. And I think that a lot of what we're trying to do there, in what I would look to is, if you're new into the agile space, is to look at things like, how do we improve our visibility into how things are currently working so that we can get a larger array of people, as in more of the individuals within the context of the team, involved in the activities of enhancing our delivery capability. So what that means practically is that instead of just doing a retrospective with maybe the senior leadership or in a management kind of a situation, what we might do is create some smaller contextual units or smaller groups where folks can actually have some improvement. So for example, maybe the recruitment function, maybe the people development, learning development, something like this, maybe some of the more administrative functions, payroll, that kind of a thing, depending on where that sits in your organization. Something like that could be useful to create autonomous units that can then go and iterate and improve and adapt how those flows and contexts are actually working. And one of the big benefits that I see is basically taking a more kind of outcomes-centric approach to what we're doing. So it's not just about, do we run X number of training classes, as I said before, or do we get 55 employees hired next Tuesday? It's things like, how long do those people stay? How effective are they as leaders and contributors in the organization? And maybe even further things along beyond that. Yeah. Cool. I'd be happy to chat more, Camilla. If you have specific questions, feel free either to reach out. Maybe you want to chat via LinkedIn or something like this. I'd be happy to jump on a call maybe and chat through some of those things specifically. Cool. So I'm not sure if I fully understand this question. Where can we find more information about Flight Table? I'm assuming you mean flight levels. One of the best places to have a look is on flightlevels.io. There's also a bunch of things that you could do in my world where you could have a look. So my website, I don't know if you would have seen it during the sign-up process for this, cliffhazel.com. On my blog, I write a number of posts about flight levels and so on. But probably the easiest way to do it, if you like this style of talking about things, is to follow me on LinkedIn and have a look there, because I'm posting pretty much every day of the week some ideas that connect to flight levels and some of the work that I've been doing. It's just sharing things that I learn along the way so that hopefully it can be helpful to some of the folks like yourself. Yeah, and of course, feel free to reach out directly, as I said already, to a couple of folks. I'm very happy to jump on either private conversations or just have a chat via Messenger if there's specific things maybe that you want to share, but you don't want to discuss it in a public context. So feel free to reach out. Cool. Awesome. Well, that's been a nice string of questions. It's very cool to have all of you here. So yes, Camilla, it's cool to hear that you say that this is validating some of your thinking. So yeah, I wish you luck, and if I can be helpful somehow, just you know where to find me. So I'm wondering if there are some more questions that are lurking in the chat. Maybe you're thinking about something else that could be interesting to discuss. I have a question actually for all of you. I'm curious if you would be willing to share. What type of role do you have in your organization? And I'm curious, I've got a couple of questions. So what is your role within your organization, firstly? Um, if you if you're up for sharing, would you type that in the chat? Cool. Delivery manager slash agile coach, says Becky. I get the sense that a couple of folks are working in sort of an agile coach slash scrum master slash delivery lead sort of a role, maybe where you're responsible at some level for some sort of agile process or something related to an agile process. Um, Bob's a consultant. Petra's a UX designer. Cool. Sophia, manager slash scrum master, chapter lead. Yeah, cool. So the reason I asked this question is because I'm curious. One of the things that I come across often is this question of like, well, which problem should we fix? Because I don't know about you, but I've yet to find an organization where there was a shortage of ideas of how to improve, or a shortage of ideas of things that we wanted to improve. I'm curious if you're seeing that in your organizations. Maybe just give a thumbs up or something in the chat. But basically, the challenge with this for me is that a big part of what that means is that we have a lot of ideas and probably some differing ideas about what is important. And so, just to kind of emphasize with what I think is so impactful about flight levels specifically, is that it gives us an opportunity to be able to map out a little bit of where can we actually make the improvements. Because I think often what we're doing is that we're trying to basically optimize or improve based on either who shouted the loudest or who has the most power and responsibility. But if we can actually map out in the organization and say, oh, look, okay, we've got level one is actually working quite well, but the challenge is these two areas, maybe they work together, but they don't yet work so well together. We could address that. Or we've got a bunch of teams that we've spun up to do a bunch of this new capability stuff around data science or machine learning or something. But how do we actually plug that into the broader organizational capability and specifically connect it to those strategic projects and initiatives? So I think that's something that is particularly interesting in this context, and maybe something that could be of interest to those of you who are working specifically in an agile process sense, because I think what's helpful here is that we can start to step out of a little bit of this kind of fixing only the teams or level one, and it gives us some tools and levers, maybe a little bit related to the question of how do we, Sophia was asking earlier about how do we convince the executives. I think often it's that shining a light on the fact that there are levers that are a little bit bigger than maybe just optimizing or improving one single team. Cool. Bob is asking, what is a hard lesson you've learned on your flight levels journey? This is a great question. Um, I think I keep getting reminded time and time again uh, of the benefit or the point of taking people on a journey with you. It's very, very easy to get caught up, and I have still done this myself from time to time, where you think you have the right answer, and it's just a case of getting people kind of on board or something like this. The thing that I've learned is that it doesn't matter how good I think an idea is, if other people don't see it and they don't feel it, it really doesn't matter. And the only thing that I'm going to do is frustrate myself quite significantly. That would be the first one. The second bit I would say is that I think it's helpful to remind not only myself, but also other people that almost regardless of how good you get at using the stuff, you're always going to have a number one problem. And I've often fallen guilty to kind of being, I don't know, maybe like obsessive about like, well, we need to fix this thing. And then, eventually we fix it, but now there's a new thing on the way. And so now that's the new problem. And there's always going to be something like this. And the reason I mention this is because Jerry Weinberg has this really cool quote. He talks about your number two problem always gets a promotion. And what he's trying to signal with this is that basically, when you fix your number one problem, it might go away for a while, but your number two problem gets elevated immediately to being your number one problem. And if you're going to always be in a space where you're like, this is the number one problem, I have to fix this thing, you're kind of going to burn yourself out and get frustrated, and certainly maybe frustrate some other people. And so part of this, I think, is a little bit related to the first part of my answer, which I think is basically what we need to do as folks who are trying to initiate and drive change is remember that the rest of the organization is really, really busy. And they don't have time necessarily, or a lot of energy, or maybe they've even seen multiple waves of people coming through the organization. There was another consultant here last week or last year, and they also had some great idea about how everything was going to change and be magic and ponies. And so meeting people a little bit kind of where they are and being okay with kind of matching the pace and the capacity of the organization to consume any kind of adaptive capability or change. I think this is really, really important, and certainly something that I've stepped on more than my fair share of times. And probably something I will do again, because I get excited about this stuff. I'm passionate. I want to help people, but the biggest thing is to make sure that you step back and only help people where they want help, because otherwise it's just inflicting help. Yeah. Hopefully that gives a bit of an answer to your question there, Bob. Cool. So we have another question here from Sophia. It's very difficult to map flight levels for a whole organization if you don't get execs involved in the conversation. From where I am, it's not going to work. How can I start with a local application of flight levels? So I actually quite like this pattern of starting in a local context where there is an opportunity. And the reason why I like this is because I like to work with the willing. I think quite simply, if there is a department and a group of folks who are keen, let's jump in and run something of a pilot, or demonstrate some uses of this, and we can go from there. I think there's nothing wrong with saying, well, we only have scope or influence or impact to be able to fix within this particular boundary. It's very rare that somebody is the CEO of the company, and usually there's a bunch of other folks who are involved in this kind of stuff, and they don't necessarily have the influence to be able to change everything. So start where we can and do what we can. So I think a local application means basically trying to find something that is a little bit broader than a single team, and perhaps trying to find some team that is connected. So maybe you have a dependency on another team in another department, or maybe in a nearby department. Maybe you have some HR, some finance, some marketing folks, or whoever it is, depending on the type of product you have, and try to build some kind of a collaboration point through building a visualization and creating some kind of focus around that. So I know that you've seen a bunch of flight levels because we've met before. So you've seen a bunch of this stuff in action in the past. But I think specifically in that context, I would say find the bit that you can influence. And if you're not able to influence enough yet, maybe use the relationships that you have to build some influence a little bit around, so that you can get some other folks perhaps a little bit on board. But I would draw attention back to what I said in answer to Bob's question as well. It's really important to make sure that you're matching your energy and enthusiasm to an extent. Take the feedback from the org. If the rest of the org is saying, we don't want to do this, maybe now is not the right time to do this, because they see something else more important. And pushing too much can often cause some challenges. I don't know if that helps, Zofia. I'd be happy to chat, as I said already, in a little bit more detail, maybe with a bit more context, but certainly in terms of starting small and then either zooming upstream or downstream, or maybe later moving up to a level 3 or something like this, this can be a great opportunity as well. Thanks for the question. Cool. Bob, with another question. What would you say is the number one problem that Flight Levels seeks to solve? Or would I say that the number one problem it seeks to solve is a lack of clarity across the org? I think that's certainly one way of framing it. I think clarity and the nuance that I would add there is around specifically focus. So, what actually is the thing we're supposed to do? Because what we usually find is that everybody is super busy and everybody is super busy on something different to somebody else. And the challenge is actually kind of connecting our efforts together. Because usually, to do any one thing, we need multiple people to do some work. But those multiple people are, of course, busy on other things. And so, if we can try to focus the attention on one thing, of course, that focus would create some kind of clarity. But I think, yeah, essentially, clarity or focus would perhaps be the thing that I would put forward as number one. That's what we're trying to clarify. And of course, we have to do this in a way that is. I think a lot of the time people forget that these things are social systems, and so it's people, right? People have opinions, we have feelings, we have needs, desires, hopes, dreams, goals, all of this kind of stuff, all wrapped up inside this sort of strange-looking shape that we are, and we want to be able to do some stuff, right? But what we need to be able to do is find a way to be able to work as a collective in some sort of a direction. And I think that this is often what we're trying to address here is actually a lack of leadership, a lack of experience, and a lack of good management. Management, I think, in the agile sphere has become a little bit of a swear word. And the problem with that is that, well, I think the reason for that is that because so few folks have actually learned what good management looks like. If you've been lucky enough to have good managers and you've seen good management in action, you probably have a little bit more faith in it than some of the folks in the agile community do. But I think essentially, if we can, as leaders, help to create that clarity so that we can have some kind of collective focus and not end up unintentionally bumping into each other constantly, this is a great, great, great outcome, and certainly the one that I'm trying to address with flight levels. Cool question. Thanks for that. I realize I missed the question. I wasn't quite sure how to answer this question earlier, asking how did you become known in the agile world? Uh, I'm not quite sure what's behind that question, but I guess people know a little bit about me because I've made a point of trying to go out and talk at conferences and get to know people and share the things that I've learned. I feel quite lucky to have had the experiences that I've had and learned some of the things that I have. And so I thought instead of just being on the consumption side of, taking the ideas that I've gathered from everybody over the many years, there's been a lot of folks who've helped me. I think it's cool to be able to give something back and share with other people. And so I try to do that as much as possible through traveling and going to conference talks, doing meetups, doing something like this, and of course the posting online. And so, yeah, if there's something that you'd like to know about any of the things that I've been up to or something that you're maybe struggling with, reach out. I'd be happy to try and help if I can. And if I don't know the answer, I can either point you to somebody who might or help you find something that could perhaps answer your questions. Cool. So I'm wondering if we have some more questions. An hour is quite a long time to answer questions with no kind of pre-planned topic or sort of specific pre-planned presentation or anything like that. I'll leave the call open for a few more minutes and see if anybody else would like to ask some questions. But one thing I'd like to ask is, I'd love to hear some feedback on how this is for you. Specifically for me, one of the things that I'd like to try to be able to find out is a little bit of, what are the things that I'm doing that are helping all of you? As I mentioned, my goal is to try to give back as much as I can and share some of the things that I've learned. And so if there's something that you're wondering about or something that you're interested in, maybe something that I haven't covered either in today's session or something in the context of maybe the post that I've been doing specifically on LinkedIn, give me a shout. I'd be happy to give you some sort of a sense, and maybe you can shape or influence some of the stuff that I end up writing and talking about over the coming weeks, days, and months. And for those of you who are maybe not already connected with me on LinkedIn, I'll just send you an invitation. If you've enjoyed the conversation that we've had this evening and we're not connected on LinkedIn, just hit the link, give me a shout. I'd be happy to chat and talk further. Cool. So what I want to say is, if you've enjoyed this session, I will ask you on YouTube just to hit a like. It helps me. I have an interest in perhaps building out further things around some of my YouTube channels, and I'm going to be experimenting with a few things on video over the coming weeks and months. And it would be super cool to know what you've enjoyed. So if there was something specific that you enjoyed about this conversation, maybe just type it in the comments and we can take it from there. Cool. So I want to thank you all for your time. I see there's one more question. Let me just quickly give that an answer and then we can go from there. Last question says, which certification is suitable for becoming an Agile coach? I don't really know how to answer that question because I'm not sure that a certification is the right way to become an Agile coach. It's not that I think that certificates are bad. It's more just a case of like having the certificate doesn't necessarily tell you if someone is a good Agile coach or not. I think the best thing to do is to go and work alongside other people who are good coaches and learn from them. There are plenty of great courses out there, a lot of cool people that you can learn from. There's probably even a bunch inside your company or in your immediate context. So I would recommend reaching out to them and seeing where you can go from there. Cool. I hope that's at least somewhat helpful. I don't have a better answer than that for you, unfortunately. Yeah. And Mark has a question. Have you had success with getting a lower level person project to get up to a CEO for expansion in the org? I am not sure that I fully understand that question. Maybe you could add a little bit of context because I'm not sure that I know what you're asking about there. I've worked with a number of CEOs. I've worked with a number of different companies, and I've seen people, moving between the levels, that kind of thing. But maybe if you could add a little bit of context, I could answer the question in a bit more detail. Cool. I will find you a little bit later on and give you an answer for that question. Cool. I want to close off this evening's session and just say thank you so much for everyone for coming. It's been super cool to spend this time with you. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. You'll see more updates and we'll do this again soon. Thanks so much for your time. It's been super fun chatting with all of you. Good luck and have fun. See you soon. Cheers.